I'm going to suggest something that you're not going to agree with.
Well, you said a lot tonight that I don't agree with. So
I understand. I understand.
Welcome, listeners, to our new show called Historical Reflections with Jim Hern, hosted by Paul Thomas. This evening, we're going to be talking about Robert E. Lee. Welcome, Jim.
Hi.
It was only recently that Robert E. Lee became a controversial historical figure. The genesis of the controversy came with the realization that the statues of Confederate generals erected in the Jim Crow heyday of the KKK were primarily vehicles of intimidation. So blacks had constant reminders to know their place in American society. The controversy climaxed during the weekend of August 11th to 12th in 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, when a Unite the Right rally tried to prevent the removal of Lee's statue with demonstrations that included torchlight marches and chants of "Jews will not replace us." The passion culminated into deadly violence when James Alex Fields Jr. drove his car into a crowd, killing Heather Heyer and injuring 35 others. The question before you, Jim, is: should General Lee be viewed with reverence as historic, in historical terms, heroic, when the people who insist on that reverence act the way they did in Charlottesville that weekend in 2017? Let me ask you this. Let me couch it this way. How do you feel about Robert E. Lee?
Robert E. Lee is a very interesting character, primarily from the perspective that there's not a whole lot known about Robert E. Lee. He didn't write his memoirs. He refused to let anybody write his biography. He died in 1870, which wasn't that far after the war, actually. And what we know about Robert E. Lee is not what we hear about Robert E. Lee from the perspective of the way history has been taught. History has been taught mostly through the view of what's called the lost cause myth, which is still the prevalent manner in which grade school and high school kids learn about the Civil War. As far as Lee's stand on a couple of things are concerned, we simply don't know. The evidence is sort of contradictory. He called slavery a great political and moral evil, but he also said in the same letter that this came from, which was a letter to his wife, that his time was not the time in which the slavery and the abolishment of slavery should take place. Inevitably, he said it was going to take place. As far as his views on slavery were concerned, what little evidence we have doesn't suggest, states outright that he, like everybody else in America at that time, never looked at slaves as equals. On the other hand, his family owned, by some reports 4, by some other reports 8 slaves, which were probably gifts to him, because his family came from, his wife came as a direct descendant from Martha Washington, and his father-in-law owned 200 slaves to run the plantations. His father-in-law died, and here's where the contradiction comes. His father-in-law died in 1856, and in his will, he said that all of his slaves were to be freed within 5 years of his death. And it appears that in 1862 that happened, although there is a lack of evidence that Lee actually signed the manumission papers. So there's controversy here. The Robert E. Lee that we know of as the hero related to his military acumen is the case, would be the case in point as to how he got to this hero status. So,
okay, here's something that isn't controversial. Lee led the army which sought to preserve slavery. And that army engaged in a rebellion against the United States, which at that time did constitutionally approve slavery, but he led that rebellion where hundreds of thousands of people ended up dead because of that rebellion. That's not controversial at all. That fact, Lee led that rebellion, led the army in that rebellion, can't be disputed.
agreed.
So we can come to what conclusion from that? Any conclusion, or does that remain contradictory?
We can debate the nature of what it is to be a hero. I don't think that's where we want to go with this. To half of the country, he was a hero. Now that he was a hero as much for his, and probably mostly because of his military acumen, as opposed to his stance on slavery. As I was pointing out, anything that was attributed to him regarding pro or con slavery was added starting right after the war with the growth and the beginning and the selling of the lost cause myth. What we could be asking here is, through the lens of the third decade of the 21st century, are we saying that Lee was personally responsible for the violence in Charlottesville? And if so, does that mean we have to revoke his status as a hero? And I'm not.
He wasn't personally responsible for the violence in Charlottesville, but the violence in Charlottesville was done in his name.
Okay, well, let's talk. Let me talk about Charlottesville for a second. Okay, because I've spent a great deal of time looking this stuff up. The city founders decided that the Lee statue had to come down. Stonewall Jackson statue had to come down. Right. But they also decided that the Lewis and Clark statue had to come down. And they also decided that another statue had to come down, which was William Clark's brother who fought in the Revolutionary War. Now, the city fathers said the reason that the statues of Lee and Jackson had to come down was because they represented the lost cause myth. They also said the reason that Lewis and Clark statue had to come down was because there was also a depiction of Sacagawea, who apparently had her eyes were cast down, and they didn't want to offend anybody by suggesting that Sacagawea was submissive. They also took down the other statue of the officer in the Revolutionary War because he fought in the northwest corner of what was then America against the English, who had hired American Indians to fight. He actually lost 4 battles before he actually won one, but because of the sensitivity towards the indigenous Americans, all of those statues had to come down. Now, I don't see how the violence in Charlottesville, I don't see how the torch parades in Charlottesville had anything to do with the Civil War or with Lewis and Clark or his brother. I think the icons that we're talking about here are simple icons. You said yourself that what you heard was the Nazi chants talking about Jews. I find that a little difficult to understand because the second most powerful man in the Confederacy was Judah Benjamin. who was the Secretary of War.
They didn't know that.
They didn't know.
I'll tell you where the connection is. The connection is the people who engaged in those torchlight chants and the march were about preserving white supremacy. That's
Right.
the connection. You don't see that?
So how are we blaming Robert E. Lee for that?
Robert E. Lee was the leader of the movement to promote and preserve white supremacy to the continued slavery of black people. Don't you think Robert E. Lee deserves some responsibility for his role in that?
Robert E. Lee led the Confederate Army.
Then the Confederate Army was the mission of the Confederate Army was to maintain the status quo of enslaving African Americans. That's what the mission of the Confederate Army was, and Lee led that army. Are you disputing that?
I don't think Lee was there to uphold slavery. I think Lee was there for one specific purpose, and that was to wipe out the Army of the Potomac. That was his job. That's all. That was his whole life was military. The fact that he owned slaves, the fact that he didn't think slaves were equal to whites, I don't think was the prime reason he was in charge of the military of the Confederacy. I don't think
you're saying to me now that you don't think that Lee was running that army in order to preserve slavery. You don't think that was the reason why he was running that army. You're thinking the reason he was running that army was to defeat the enemy. And yes. The enemy happened to be the United States government.
Correct.
Okay. Can you see how respect for Confederate generals can be interpreted as a belief that slavery was okay? You seem to have the belief that Robert E. Lee didn't really consider slavery as the reason why he chose the position that he was in as the leader of the army. Now, today, we have that respect. And you and I disagree on this because I don't believe that Robert E. Lee deserves the respect that you possibly believe he deserves. But do you believe how it can be interpreted that this respect for those generals who were involved in a war to preserve slavery believe that it was okay? Slavery was okay. So let's respect those generals because that's what they believe.
Of course, that's what the soldiers believed. The soldiers.
I'm talking about today. Respect for the Confederate generals that a lot of people have today. Can you see how it could be interpreted by people who feel like oppressed a little bit by current society? That respect is an interpretation that slavery was okay. Okay,
then we're going. Then the area that we're stepping into right now is the area of the lost cause myth. Period. The Robert E. Lee became a cult figure back in the 20s without knowing much about Robert E. Lee at all. The generals became cult figures back in the 20s and 30s. The lost myth was perpetrated starting in 1866. Once he died, all the generals wrote books because they didn't want to be blamed for losing the war. And that's why this lost cause myth was perpetrated on the rest of the United States. It is the basis for which kids in grade school and high school today, when they learn about the Civil War, hear about Robert E. Lee, hear about how great of a man he was, or at least how great of a general he was.
And you don't think it had anything to do with the fact that the white supremacists wanted to maintain control over and maintain oppression of the black populations down in the Jim Crow South and also in the North? You
Absolutely.
don't think that had anything to do with
That
that?
is why the lost cause myth has done as much damage as it has. The idea is the lost cause myth was sold to the North. The North bought it because they like motion pictures. They like Gone with the Wind. They like Birth of a Nation. The South believed it because they wanted to. They didn't want to blame their generals. And as a result of that, the whole psyche of the United States regarding the Civil War that has been taught since the Civil War has been that there is to be respect for the generals in the Confederacy. At the same time, the lost cause myth was co-opted starting in the second or third generation after the Civil War as a way of getting us to look one way while they in the South started lynching people.
Okay, so you mentioned lost cause myth probably about 15 times already. So let me see if I can make this connection about the lost cause myth that you cited. Do you feel that the lost cause myth then was used as a tool for the white supremacists to maintain their oppressive dominance over black populations?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
They taught the North that the lost cause myth would be an easier way to reconcile differences. At the same time, as I say, they were perpetrating violence.
Does the fact that slavery took place in an earlier era justify the feeling of the believers in the cause of Confederacy, I guess you call it the lost cause myth, as just because it was normal then? So I guess we're going back to what you were saying about the soldiers at that time believing in the cause. The fact that it took place in the 1860s, was it justify the feeling that their cause was just? Do you feel that they had justification for the belief that slavery was normal?
99% of the soldiers in the Confederacy didn't own slaves.
I'm not saying I'm not that doesn't have anything to do with it. I'm talking about their beliefs because they fought in a war and they risked their lives for this cause, whether
Let's
they
talk.
owned slaves or not. That doesn't have anything to do with it.
They fought in an ugly, brutal war for 4 years. There's two reasons for that. I don't believe slavery was in their minds when they lined up at Gettysburg. The two reasons that they fought for 4 long years was because their generals were telling them they were winning. And the second cause, and the most important cause from the typical soldier from the Confederacy, was that they just flat out hated Yankees. We see that all the time in the history of the Civil War from the South's perspective. Talk about Nathan Bedford Forrest.
You said that the Southern soldiers did not own slaves and that they were fighting in this war because the generals told them that they were winning the war. Don't you believe, though, that the fact that they were fighting to preserve their status in a society where there was someone well below them, talking about the black slaves, the Negroes, was also a very motivating factor for them to fight the war, to fight in the Confederate Army?
Now we're trying to consider the mind of a corporal or less in the Army of the South who never owned slaves, who worked their own farms, dirt poor, who never had enough food, who never had enough weapons, who never had anything else. We're trying to attribute the reason that they did it for 4 years to the idea that they were fighting for the cause of keeping the plantation owners in slaves.
No, they were fighting. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that they were fighting because their ranking in the society of the South was higher than the blacks, and they wanted to preserve that. That's what I'm asking. Is that a possibility in your thinking that could be the reason why they fought?
Is it plausible? Yes. Is it also plausible that they were fighting because they believed that they were fighting the War of Independence? If you hear the Lost Cause guys, I listen to, because the last one of our programs was titled Civil War. I got a bunch of YouTube videos directly under our copy of it, which were lectures done recently about some battle in the Civil War, and the lecturers were Southern. They had Southern drawls, and they believed absolutely that the soldiers in the South were convinced that they were fighting another war of independence. And that was their primary motivation.
Well, sure, their War of Independence was one where they were going to be independent from anybody who claimed that slavery was wrong. Their new nation was going to have slavery preserved.
Their war of no, their war. Well, is that a plausible explanation? Yes. Is it the reason? I think not. I think they wanted to be independent of the damn Yankees. I think that under that way of looking at it, they were also convinced that they were being invaded, and therefore had a right to defend themselves. If you want to say they had a right to defend slavery, okay, they had a right to defend slavery, even though they didn't have slaves or work with slaves or even knew many slaves. I think that we're trying to get it, as I say, we're trying to get into the minds of a typical fighting man who fought in this bloody war for 4 years. Their motivation had to be something beyond ideology.
I don't think that's ideology as much as it's a social pecking order, because I think that the transference of that thought process about staying higher than the blacks continued on through the 19th century all the way into the current day. You saw what happened in Tennessee whenever you had these young black men that had the temerity to speak out against gun violence. They were expelled from their duly elected positions in the Tennessee state legislature. Why were they? Well, I think it was because not only because they were speaking against something that the Republican majority wanted not even to discuss, but because they were black. And I think that's a continuation of the thought process that has been going on in this country since 1619. And the disputation of that notion is what's causing us to continue to have these racial problems. Cops killing blacks at a much higher rate than they kill anybody else. We can go back to swimming pools and redlining and all that, but it's the thought process that many white people feel that they're entitled to. And that is, we're superior to you because we come from Europe and you came from Africa. And because of that very fact, we need to maintain social systems that allow us to maintain that superiority. You don't think there's a connection there throughout time with that thinking?
I think the issue first came to a head at the end of the Civil War, not during the Civil War. I don't think.
What event are you citing then that brought this issue to a head?
Could have been a number of things. Robert E. Lee's death, which allowed Robert E. Lee spent the last 3 or 4 years of his life talking to Southerners about reconciliation. All that did was piss him off. Reconstruction was a terrible thing from a perspective of keeping troops in the South. All of that was there to punish the South for the Civil War. They began reacting as they could have against people who formerly were not free and had no status whatsoever, now had more status than they thought they were entitled to. And that's when the undercurrent behind the lost cause myth allowed them to start actually shooting and hanging people. It's gone.
And you think that's okay? You think that's okay?
No, I didn't say that was okay. I disagree with it completely, as any Any human being would. But it continues to this day for reasons that you asked me, when did it start? I say it started with Reconstruction.
You just said Reconstruction was a horrible thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Horrible enough
Well,
to unleash the dogs in the South.
You don't think the dogs were unleashed prior to the time whenever they thought it was just okay for, because you're black, you're a slave? You don't think those dogs were unleashed? They didn't get unleashed until after the Civil War?
And we haven't heard the beginning. We haven't even heard the beginnings of that history. That part of history was not known, and still isn't to a large extent known until our time, until the last.
I got some things for you to read, buddy. The 1619 Project. You ever read that?
I have just taken a very close look at the entire project.
Okay. Did you read the whole thing?
Did I read it word for word? No.
Okay. The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. Did you ever read that?
No.
Okay. The history is there, but it's the selective reading that maybe is leading you to the conclusion that we're not having that.
I'm not arguing I'm not arguing with the 1619 project. I'm not arguing with that at all. I'm not arguing that there was no evidence to the contrary. There was evidence to the contrary of the lost cause myth starting at the same time they started it. What I'm suggesting to you is that history and that evidence largely has been ignored.
It has been ignored by the people who don't want to change the status quo, which
Correct.
is white supremacy.
Which is what I'm talking about. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
All right. Do you see that the foundation of the polarization of our politics today is based on racism, or maybe some other reason, like Marxism, say, economic inequality, the polarization of our society? How much does racism play in that?
Well, as far as our elected officials are concerned, if we're using that as the core and the starting place for the divisiveness, I'm going to suggest something that you're not going to agree with.
Well, you said a lot tonight that I don't agree with. So
I understand it. I understand it. Looking into this question, currently 124 members of Congress in Washington identify as minority. That's 97% higher than the prior Congress. So if divisiveness is the only goal of Congress, and the divisiveness is based on hatred of minorities, they're losing the battle. More and more of their own colleagues are identifying now as minority. They're going to lose that. If it were 70-30 the other way, would we still be arguing about the disparity in the way in which Afro-Americans are being treated? I don't particularly see that. As far as Marxism and communism is concerned, those two ideologies don't lend themselves very well to sound bites outside of Congress, or at least they haven't since Joe McCarthy died. So I don't see that as the problem. What I see as the core issue of the divisiveness in this country is the upper 1, 2, 3, or 4%. Ultimately the upper class of the economic world in this country are spending their money in order to improve their position and, in my estimation, to keep the rest of us down. Yes, it's disproportionate from a racist standpoint towards Black Americans right now, but the rest of us are being kept down by the moneyed interests. And until we all get together and decide that we've had enough of that nonsense, and together, racism is not going to change because that's what they're paying.
Okay, let me see if I can connect those two thoughts that you laid out here. There's been a lot of success, electoral success, for the moneyed interests, as far as politicians who represent those moneyed interests, and the reason for that, one of the reasons for that electoral success is because they have convinced a lot of the lower income voters to vote their way. And one of the things that they have married together was these dog whistle racial policies. This is my opinion now, that has got them to believe that, well, we better not vote for the liberals because they're going to do is improve the status of the black people, and that may reduce our status. So I'm going to vote for these rich people, the people who are representing the rich interests, because I don't want those others to maintain the social status that I am enjoying, even though I ain't enjoying much because I'm dirt poor as well. So, do you think that has been a successful propagandal tool for these interests that have maintained their wealth through the political process?
Because the wealth supports both sides.
Right.
Not just the right, not just the left, not just the liberals, not just the conservatives. They don't care. They don't care which side you're on as long as the outcome keeps everybody down. This is why almost all of the elections, at least on a national basis, come down to 51% to 49%. Either way. Okay, if it were 90-10, I would say your argument for voting for what the rich people wanted would be because all the rich people are doing the same thing. They're not. Are they in collusion with each other? You bet they are.
I have to dispute your analysis about the 49-51, because there are a lot of people who are currently sitting not only in Congress but in state houses, particularly, it's on the front page now of Tennessee, where they ran unopposed. There was no one to run against them in their gerrymandered districts. So that's not necessarily the case of having these close elections. A lot of times there isn't an election because the incumbent has no opponent at all.
Okay. Who pays for the gerrymandering?
Well, it depends on what state. Gerrymandering has occurred in Maryland by the Democrats, in New York by the Democrats, in Tennessee and Wisconsin by the Republicans.
So there aren't any states where liberals have won by a greater majority than 51%? We're just talking about Tennessee.
No. We'll look at Maryland. Maryland's a good example where you have it heavily gerrymandered in favor of the Democrats. Exactly. New York was a good example where you had it heavily gerrymandered in favor of the Republicans until their court ended up throwing those maps out, and they had more equitable maps, and the result was more Republicans ended up going to Congress from New York than had early had been predicted otherwise before those gerrymanders maps were thrown out by those courts.
So where's the money going? To Maryland and Tennessee, or is it going to Wisconsin? Is it going to states that are on the cusp, that are 50-50? When was the last time?
It's going everywhere, primarily incumbents. Now, I just heard today that of all these, and we have a super majority down in Tennessee where we have these gerrymandered districts, super majority, that the Koch brothers had donated to every one of those $27,000. And if you already start out in these state legislative races with that $27,000 you can throw in your bank, and you get people that want to run against that, they're lucky if they can raise $5,000 from the people. And so that's clearly where that's coming from. So all right, let's move on. Let's move on here. As we look at history, how much does the admiration of historical figures play into the conclusions we reach from our studies? We have a lot of Confederate generals that are looked at admirably. And my question to you is, does that admiration play into the conclusion that we have whenever we decide what's good and what's bad? Scratching your beard there.
How does it play into the conclusions we reach from our studies? My
Yeah.
answer is going to be very clear. About as much as blind admiration and conclusions made without knowledge, particularly knowledge that comes from effort, about Jesus does. What I am suggesting is, if we are to conclude that the heroes, as they're placed in society, are icons to march around in circles and chant Nazi slogans are concerned, then, as far as I'm concerned, I don't see that history actually makes a difference at all. Now, let me just finish. And I'm going to read this because I thought about this and rewrote it a number of times. So what do we learn from history? As regards the Civil War, have we learned that useless slaughter of our own population truly doesn't make sense? Have we learned that equality for all cannot be forced at gunpoint? Have we learned that the possible price of success should be measured in assassination? Have we learned that evil, lying, would-be despots should not be elected to important positions? It would appear not.
Yeah, I agree. We have not learned that lesson at all. All right, Jim. Hey, this was a really good inaugural opening for our new show, Historical Reflections with Jim Hern, hosted by Paul Thomas. So all you out there, you cranky curmudgeon viewers, this is our new show. Next time we're going to be talking about the juxtaposition of Abraham Lincoln versus Jefferson Davis.